It was a dark and foggy night on August 7th, the kind that makes every shadow look like something lurking just beyond the trees. I was driving alone down an isolated road deep in the forest, the only light coming from my dim headlights cutting through the thick fog. The road was narrow, with towering trees on either side, and the silence was almost suffocating. My radio had lost signal hours ago, leaving only the soft hum of the engine to keep me company. The deeper I drove, the more I felt something wasn't right, like I was being watched by unseen eyes hidden in the darkness. As the minutes dragged on, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through the dense forest with no signs of life. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. Every time I glanced into the rearview mirror, I expected to see something there, some shadowy figure following me. But each time, there was nothing. I tried to focus on the road, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Yet, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger with every passing mile. The silence outside was broken by an odd sound, like a faint whisper carried on the wind. I glanced out the window, but there was nothing but the endless blur of trees. My heart began to race as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more distinct, but I couldn't understand them. I turned up the heater, hoping the warmth would calm me down, but it only added to the suffocating atmosphere inside the car. Then, without warning, my headlights flickered. My heart skipped a beat as the lights dimmed for a moment before coming back on. I slowed down, my eyes scanning the road ahead for any signs of danger. But the road remained empty. Just as I was about to speed up again, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A dark figure standing on the side of the road, motionless. My blood ran cold. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I stared into the rearview mirror, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The figure was still there, standing by the side of the road, its form barely visible through the thick fog. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it hadn't moved. My heart pounded in my chest as a wave of dread washed over me. Instinct screamed at me to drive faster, to get away from whatever that thing was. I pressed down on the accelerator, feeling the car lurch forward as the engine roared to life. The trees rushed past me, their dark silhouettes blending into one another as I sped down the road. I kept glancing in the mirror, hoping to leave that figure far behind. But then, to my horror, I saw it again. This time, it was closer, too close. It was no longer on the side of the road. It was right behind my car, moving unnaturally fast, almost as if it were floating. Panic surged through me as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The road ahead twisted and turned, but I barely noticed. My focus locked on the rearview mirror. The figure seemed to be gaining on me, despite how fast I was driving. I couldn't see its face, just a dark, featureless shape with an eerie, unnatural presence. I felt my breath quicken, my chest tightening with fear. How could it be following me like this? What did it want? I took a sharp turn, tires screeching on the asphalt, hoping to lose whatever was chasing me. For a brief moment, I dared to hope that I had escaped. The road stretched out before me, empty once more, and the figure was nowhere to be seen. I exhaled shakily, trying to calm my racing heart. But the relief was short-lived. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced at the rearview mirror again and saw it sitting in the back seat of my car. My heart stopped as I saw the dark figure sitting in the back seat. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no eyes, just an ominous shadow filling the space behind me. Cold sweat dripped down my forehead, and I felt frozen in place. My mind raced, desperately trying to process what was happening. How could it have gotten inside? I didn't dare to turn around. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, though every fiber of my being wanted to look back. The air in the car grew heavy, suffocating. I could hear my own shallow breaths echoing in the silence. The figure remained still, but its presence was unbearable. I tried to remind myself that I needed to stay in control. My thoughts were a blur of fear and confusion, but I knew one thing. I had to get out of this situation. I kept driving, hoping that somehow, if I just kept going, this nightmare would end. Then a whisper came from behind me, soft but clear. It wasn't words, just a sound, like a breath or a murmur. My body tensed as I gripped the wheel even tighter. I felt the presence lean forward, and I could almost sense it right behind my shoulder. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I felt as if I were sinking deeper into the seat. I couldn't bear it anymore. I had to do something. I glanced at the road ahead and saw a clearing coming up on my right. Without thinking, I swerved off the road and into the clearing. The car jolted violently as I drove over uneven ground, the headlights bouncing wildly as I tried to regain control. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, as though waiting for something. I felt a growing sense of dread, but I pressed on. I needed to stop, to escape this thing. Finally, the car came to a sudden halt, the engine sputtering and the lights flickering before dying completely. The figure disappeared. The car fell into an eerie silence as the engine ceased its rumbling. I sat there frozen, the dim light of dawn starting to break through the fog. My heart was still racing, and my breath came in short, shaky bursts. I glanced around the clearing, but the figure was gone. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of early morning birds. I couldn't believe I had survived this ordeal. Taking a deep breath, I slowly got out of the car, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I looked around, the mist starting to lift, revealing the surrounding forest. It was peaceful now, almost serene, as if the terrifying events of the night had never happened. I checked the car, relieved to find it still operational, though the fog and fear made the surroundings seem almost unreal. I felt a wave of exhaustion and relief wash over me. As I drove back towards the campsite, the night's events began to feel like a distant nightmare. The road seemed familiar once more, the trees less menacing in the daylight. I reached the campsite just as the sun was rising, casting a warm glow over everything. My friends were waking up, and I told them about my ordeal, but they could hardly believe it. They joked about me being tired and imagining things, but I knew the truth. Despite the terror I had faced, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had faced my fears and survived. As I sat around the campfire later that day, the memory of the shadowy figure remained vivid, but I took comfort in knowing I had made it through. The forest no longer seemed as ominous, and I felt grateful for the dawn and the safety it brought. It was September 12th, and I was driving back to my campsite after a long day trip to a nearby town. The highway seemed endless, surrounded by dense woods that swallowed the moonlight. The only illumination came from my car's headlights, casting long, distorted shadows on the road ahead. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the steady hum of the engine. My GPS screen flickered sporadically, which I attributed to the lack of signal in this remote area. The deeper I drove into the forest, the darker it became, the road curving and stretching into the unknown. A thick mist began to roll in, swirling around the car and obscuring my view. My headlights barely cut through the fog, making the woods seem even more foreboding. I could barely make out the outlines of the trees on either side, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It felt as if I was driving through a scene from a horror movie. I tried to distract myself with the radio, but it only played static. The GPS was useless, constantly searching for a signal that wasn't there. My unease grew with each passing mile. I felt as though I was being pulled further into an unseen trap, the familiar road morphing into something more sinister. The mist seemed to thicken, and the car's interior lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the dashboard. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and began to lose power. I glanced at the dashboard. Everything seemed normal. I tried restarting the engine, but it only groaned and whined. Panic set in as I pulled to the side of the road, hoping it was just a temporary glitch. The mist outside seemed to close in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows. I sat in the car, trying to calm my racing heart as the engine continued to sputter. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional pop and crackle from the mist pressing against the windows. The headlights flickered weakly, barely penetrating the dense fog that seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and the surrounding woods appeared to be closing in, their dark shapes looming menacingly. After several tense minutes, I decided to check if I had a cell signal, but my phone was completely dead, despite being fully charged earlier. Frustration and fear mingled as I realized I was utterly cut off from help. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming. I looked around, trying to spot any signs of civilization, but the fog obscured everything beyond a few feet. The only sound was the rhythmic drip of moisture from the trees onto the car's roof. Then, I noticed something strange in the distance. A faint, flickering light appeared through the fog, moving slowly towards me. My initial relief was quickly overshadowed by a deep sense of dread. Was it a car or something else? The light was too erratic to be a vehicle, and it seemed to be moving unnaturally, swaying from side to side. My anxiety mounted as the light grew brighter, and I could just make out a shadowy figure walking alongside it. I tried to start the car again, but it refused to turn over. The shadowy figure drew closer, the light now illuminating the mist around it. My fear intensified as the figure seemed to stop directly beside my car. I could barely make out its form, a tall, indistinct shape that seemed almost ghostly. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stood silently, and I wondered if it was a person or something far more sinister. The light continued to flicker, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the fog-covered trees. The figure outside remained motionless, its presence sending chills down my spine. I strained to see more details, but the fog and darkness rendered everything vague and indistinct. The flickering light seemed to pulse, casting erratic shadows that danced on the mist. My fear turned to curiosity as I wondered who or what this figure could be. I wanted to get out of the car to investigate, but the thought of stepping into the unknown kept me rooted in place. As the minutes ticked by, the figure suddenly began to move again, but it did so in a strange, jerky manner. It was as though it was struggling to move through an unseen barrier. The light bobbed up and down, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the surrounding trees and fog. My anxiety grew as the figure's movements became more erratic, almost as if it were trapped or struggling with something unseen. I could hear faint murmurs carried by the wind, adding to the growing sense of unease. Just then, the figure stopped and turned towards me. I could see a faint outline of what seemed like a face, but it was distorted and obscured by the flickering light. I felt a shiver of terror as the figure extended a hand, its gesture slow and deliberate. It seemed as though it was reaching out, beckoning me to follow. I hesitated, my mind racing with thoughts of what might lie beyond the fog. The urge to stay in the safety of my car battled with an inexplicable curiosity. Before I could make a decision, the figure abruptly vanished into the mist, and the light went out. The sudden darkness was almost more terrifying than the figure itself. I tried starting the car again, but it was no use. I was left alone in the suffocating fog, with only the sounds of the forest and my own pounding heart for company. The figure's disappearance left me with a lingering sense of dread and confusion, as if I had missed something crucial or been part of something inexplicable. The fog grew denser as I waited in the car, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. The darkness outside was oppressive, and the silence was almost unbearable. I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on me, and every rustle or creak from the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. My nerves were frayed, and I could hardly think straight. My attempts to restart the engine were futile, adding to my growing sense of despair. Just as I began to lose hope, a distant soft glow appeared through the fog, not unlike the flickering light from before. I was startled, my pulse quickening. Was it the same figure or something else? The light approached slowly, its source hidden by the thick mist. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but the fog distorted everything. The light's erratic movement suggested it was not a stable, steady source of illumination. The light finally reached my car, and I saw a dark silhouette in its glow. My heart leaped as I hoped it might be a passerby who could help. I rolled down the window slightly, trying to call out, but no sound escaped my lips. My voice felt trapped. The silhouette moved closer, but as the light dimmed, it became clear that it was not a person, but a floating orb of light, pulsating gently. The orb hovered near the car, casting a strange, otherworldly glow on the fog. I felt a mix of awe and terror as it seemed to communicate something beyond my understanding. It moved slowly away from the car, as if inviting me to follow. My fear and curiosity clashed as I considered stepping out. Just then, the orb drifted back into the fog, and the light gradually faded until it was swallowed by the darkness. The oppressive silence returned, leaving me alone with my fear. I remained in the car, staring into the darkness, unable to shake the feeling of being part of something inexplicable. The engine finally roared back to life, and I drove cautiously back towards the campsite. The fog began to lift, but the encounter left me with more questions than answers. I reached the campsite just as dawn was breaking, the mist finally dissipating. Though I was safe, the mysterious light and figure left me with a lingering sense of unease and the unsettling knowledge that some mysteries remain unsolved. It was August 25th, and the moon hung low and full in the sky as I drove down a remote highway, heading back to my campsite after a solitary evening hike. The road was winding and poorly lit, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in on me with every curve. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, but the shadows of the trees loomed ominously on the road, giving the impression that they were reaching out to pull me into the depths of the forest. The silence was almost unnerving, broken only by the sound of my tires crunching on the gravel road and the occasional hoot of an owl. I had been driving for what felt like hours, my mind lost in thought, when a soft, distant wail pierced the night. I dismissed it as an animal or the wind, though it seemed to linger, growing louder and more mournful as I continued driving. The wail echoed in the emptiness, and I felt a chill run down my spine, though the night was unseasonably warm. As I rounded a bend, I noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. I stared in shock and confusion. The figure was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress that seemed to flutter in the breeze. Her hair hung loose and disheveled, and she stood motionless, staring blankly ahead. The eerie light of the moon cast an ethereal glow on her, making her appear almost spectral. I rolled down my window, trying to speak to her, but my voice caught in my throat. The woman did not move or acknowledge my presence. The wail I had heard earlier seemed to be emanating from her, a haunting, sorrowful sound that filled the air with a palpable sense of despair. I felt a profound sadness and helplessness as I realized that this was no ordinary encounter. It was as if the woman was trapped between worlds, her spirit bound to the road. Tears welled up in my eyes as I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was dead. The figure remained motionless, her sorrowful wail growing louder, resonating with the deep emptiness of the night. I felt a sense of profound loss and grief, as if I had stumbled upon a tragic, unresolved story. I wanted to offer comfort, to help in some way, but I was powerless to do so. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly backed away, my heart heavy with the weight of the encounter. I drove off, the woman's wail fading into the distance, leaving me with an overwhelming sadness that lingered long after I had returned to the campsite. I lay awake that night, haunted by the image of the woman, and the sense that her sorrow would never be resolved. I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but the signal was non-existent in this remote area. My heart pounded as I watched the woman standing in front of my car. The wail grew more intense, resonating with a deep, unsettling sadness that seemed to penetrate the very air. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, feeling a growing sense of dread and sorrow. The woman's ghostly presence was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Her eyes fixed on something unseen, her expression one of profound anguish. With trembling hands, I opened the car door, stepping out onto the gravel road. The cool night air hit me, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and damp earth. I approached the woman slowly, each step feeling heavier as I neared her. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, as though it were shifting with each movement. The wail seemed to echo from the depths of the forest, intertwining with the sound of my footsteps. I could now see the woman's face more clearly. Her features were gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with a deep, endless sorrow. As I got closer, I tried to speak to her, but my voice faltered. "Are you okay? Can I help you?" My words seemed to vanish into the night, swallowed by the overwhelming sadness that surrounded us. The woman did not respond. She remained motionless, her gaze distant and vacant. The wail continued, a mournful cry that seemed to come from a place of unbearable grief. My chest tightened with an inexplicable sorrow as I stood before her, feeling utterly powerless to alleviate her suffering. I reached out a hand, hesitantly touching her arm. It was icy cold, and my touch made her shiver slightly. She turned her head slowly towards me, her eyes meeting mine with an expression of deep, unspoken pain. In that moment, I felt a connection, a shared understanding of her torment. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, just the unending wail that seemed to emanate from her very soul. I felt tears streaming down my face as I tried to comprehend the magnitude of her sorrow. Realizing that I could not help her, I stepped back, my heart heavy with grief. I turned and walked slowly back to my car, the woman's figure fading into the darkness behind me. The road seemed longer and more desolate as I drove away, the weight of her sadness pressing down on me. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, but she was gone. The night was still and quiet again, but the sorrowful wail lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder of the encounter. I drove back to the campsite in a daze, the sadness of the night settling over me like a shroud. The woman's gaze held mine, and I could see the weight of centuries of sorrow etched into her eyes. The road, the forest, and even the car felt like distant memories as I became wholly immersed in the tragic presence before me. Her form seemed to waver slightly, as though she were not entirely of this world. The wail, now a constant haunting melody, seemed to resonate with her every breath. It was a cry of loss, an echo of something deeply buried. Desperation clawed at me. I wanted to help her, to ease her suffering, but I had no idea how. I looked around, searching for something, anything, that might explain her presence or offer a clue to her plight. The forest loomed dark and silent, offering no answers, only the oppressive weight of its shadowy branches. The moonlight, while bright, seemed to accentuate the despair rather than illuminate the way forward. I glanced back at the car, feeling a pang of helplessness. Inside, my phone sat dead, and I realized how truly isolated I was. I returned my attention to the woman, whose silence was almost louder than the wail. I took a deep breath and tried to speak again, my voice wavering. "Is there anything I can do? Please, tell me how to help you." My words seemed to float away, lost in the night. The woman's lips moved again, but no words emerged. Her eyes, however, conveyed a profound sadness that words could never fully capture. I noticed her hand, which seemed to tremble slightly. I reached out, gently clasping it, feeling its icy coldness seep through my own warmth. Her grip was weak, almost as if she were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. I could sense a deep, unfulfilled yearning in her touch. I knew I was running out of time. The darkness of the forest felt like it was closing in, and the cold night air grew colder still. I wanted to stay and help, but the fear of becoming a part of the same tragic fate began to creep in. With one final, sorrowful look, I turned back towards my car. The woman's wail followed me, growing fainter, but still resonating deeply within me. As I got back into the car and started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The woman had disappeared into the fog, leaving only the mournful cry of her anguish lingering in the night. I drove away, feeling the weight of her sorrow on my shoulders, the moon and forest receding into the distance. The road back seemed interminable, and the sense of loss I felt was profound and unshakable. The encounter left me with an aching sadness that would haunt me long after the night had passed. With a heavy heart, I knew I had to leave. The eerie sadness of the woman was overwhelming, and despite my desperation to help, I felt utterly powerless. I took one last look at her, her spectral form bathed in the pale moonlight. The wail continued, an endless lament that seemed to seep into my very soul. The night grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in even more tightly around me, reinforcing my sense of isolation and dread. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I wish I could do more." The woman's eyes met mine one final time, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding, or perhaps even gratitude in their depths. Then, as if acknowledging my helplessness, she slowly began to fade. Her form became translucent, blending with the mist that shrouded the road. The wail diminished, becoming a soft, sorrowful echo that lingered in the air even as her presence disappeared. I turned and walked back to my car, feeling the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on my shoulders. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced around one last time, hoping to catch a final glimpse of the tragic figure. But the forest was empty, the fog beginning to lift with the approach of dawn. The car's engine roared to life, and I drove away from the spot, my heart aching with the weight of what I had witnessed. The road seemed endless as I drove, the early morning light casting a pale glow on the landscape. I reached the campsite just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The area was serene and quiet, a stark contrast to the night's events. My friends greeted me with concern, but I could only manage a tired, distant smile. The woman's image remained vivid in my mind, her mournful wail an indelible mark on my soul. That night, as I lay in my tent, sleep eluded me. The encounter with the ghostly woman haunted my thoughts, filling me with an inescapable sense of sadness. The knowledge that I could not alleviate her suffering weighed heavily on me. I closed my eyes, trying to escape the echo of her wail, but the haunting memory remained, a somber reminder of the unfulfilled cries of a lost soul trapped between worlds.